In the swirling snow, a little boy stood trembling outside a convenience store, his face pressed against the cold brick wall, clutching a torn backpack with a faded dinosaur print. When Max knelt beside him, the cold authority that usually commanded the city's underworld seemed to soften. "I can't go home until I bring back food." His voice was barely audible, broken, like something inside him had long since shattered. The man's jaw tightened. His eyes, cold as steel, flickered with something he hadn't felt in 20 years, rage, yes, but also recognition. He saw a ghost in that boy's hollow gaze, a ghost named Jamie, and what Maxwell Thornton did next would change both their fates forever. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because the best stories are the ones we experience together. Max didn't say anything else. He only rose slowly, slipped off his expensive black cashmere coat, then gently settled it over the boy's bony shoulders. Tommy went rigid for an instant. His whole body drew tight like a stretched wire, shoulders hunched, head bowed low as if he were bracing for a blow. That reflex made Max stop in the middle of the motion. He'd seen that reflex before, a long time ago, on another child, in another house, in another life he'd tried to bury for 20 years. But then the warmth of the fine wool sank gradually into skin that had gone numb with cold. Tommy loosened little by little, his shoulders dropping, his breathing slowing. The boy didn't look up at Max, but his small trembling fingers tugged the coat's hem tighter around himself, as if afraid someone would snatch it away. Pierce stood a few steps off, back against the brick wall, sharp eyes sweeping the dark alley. His hand stayed in his pocket, thumb resting lightly against the pistol grip. 15 years at Max's side had made Pierce used to protecting his boss from every kind of danger. But tonight, the biggest danger was a gaunt 6-year-old child shivering in the snow. Max bent down, trying to lower his voice, to soften the cold timbre he'd used to command all of Chicago for more than a decade. "What's your name?" "Tommy." The boy's voice was only a whisper, eyes still fixed on the filthy snow at his feet. "Tommy," Max repeated. "Who do you live with?" "Uncle Frank." "Where's your uncle?" Tommy hesitated. He answered one word at a time, slowly, as if every word had to be weighed with care before it could be let out. "On the south side, the apartment complex near the old factory." Max nodded. He knew that area, one of the worst parts of Chicago, the kind of place even his own people didn't want to go unless they had to. "Did your uncle make you go out to beg for food?" Tommy didn't answer. The boy only hugged his tattered bag closer to his chest, as if it were a shield against the world. "Let me see what's in your backpack." Tommy looked up for the first time, eyes wide with fear. Then he lowered his head again, slowly unzipping the battered old bag. Inside there was only a box of bread gone green with mold and an empty plastic bottle. "I tried," Tommy said, his voice shaking, "but today nobody gave me anything." Max took in the contents of the bag, the moldy bread, the empty bottle before meeting the child's hollow gaze, and anger rose in his chest. Not the kind that flared hot the way it usually did when he faced an enemy. This was something colder, deeper, like steel tempered in fire, and then plunged into ice water. He straightened and turned to Pierce. "Call the car. We're taking the boy home. I need to talk to his uncle." Pierce didn't ask. He only nodded, pulled out his phone, and sent a brief text. But the moment he heard the words home, Tommy panicked. The boy lunged toward Max, small fingers clutching the front of his vest, eyes stretched wide with terror. "Please don't. He'll be mad. He'll—" Tommy's voice caught, as if something had slammed shut across his throat. Max bent down, set one hand on Tommy's shoulder, gentle but steady. He looked straight into those trembling eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was ice cold, yet every word carried the weight of an oath. "He won't be mad anymore. I promise." Tommy stared at Max, not understanding. The boy was used to the hollow promises of adults, but there was something in the man's gaze, an absolute certainty, an unshakable power, that left the boy silent. Pierce watched from a distance. He'd followed Max for 15 years, had seen his boss face enemies, betrayal, situations balanced on the edge of life and death, but he'd never seen that look in Max's eyes. Not the usual cold calculation, not the ruthlessness of a kingpin. This was something else, something more personal, deeper, more dangerous. The black Maybach glided to the mouth of the alley, headlights tearing through the white curtain of snow. Pierce opened the rear door, and Max placed a light hand at Tommy's back, guiding the boy toward the car. Tommy followed like a sleepwalker, still unable to believe what was happening. He climbed into the back seat, curled into the farthest corner, his torn backpack clutched tight against his chest. Max sat down beside him, keeping just enough distance not to frighten the boy further. The car pulled away. Chicago slipped past the windows, neon lights smeared in the falling snow. Pierce sat in front, silent as he entered the address into the GPS. Max didn't look outside. He looked at the boy sitting an arm's length away, small and trembling inside a coat far too big for him. And in Max's mind, the image of another child rose up, just as small, just as frightened, just as fixed on him with eyes full of hope. Jamie. The black Maybach swept along the frozen streets, and for the first time in a long time, Maxwell Thornton didn't think about his empire, didn't think about million-dollar negotiations, didn't think about enemies or allies. He thought only of a child shivering beside him, and of the silent promise he'd just laid down for himself. This time, he wouldn't fail. The Maybach came to a stop in front of a crumbling apartment building on the south side, a place where even the streetlights didn't bother to shine. Snow drifted down over the rotting wooden steps, softening, if only slightly, the decay of the leaning 3-story structure. The hallway light flickered weakly, casting restless shadows that danced across peeling walls. Max stepped out of the car, his eyes sweeping over the entire scene with undisguised coldness. Pierce and 2 other men followed, their hands already resting inside their coats. Max turned to them. "Wait here. I'll go up alone." Pierce started to object, but the look in Max's eyes silenced him. The boss had decided, and when Maxwell Thornton decided something, no one stood in his way. Max bent down and gently helped Tommy out of the car. The boy's feet touched the dirty snow, his eyes lifting toward the building with fear he couldn't hide. They began to climb the stairs. Each step groaned beneath their weight, as if lamenting its own age. Tommy walked behind Max, and the higher they went, the slower the boy's steps became. By the 2nd floor, he was nearly dragging his feet, his small legs heavy as stone. Max didn't hurry him. He simply slowed his own pace, waiting, while his eyes scanned the dim corridor lined with shut doors and thick with the smell of damp decay. Frank Price's apartment was at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway. Max stopped before the peeling blue door and knocked 3 short, decisive times. Heavy footsteps thudded from inside, followed by a muttered curse. The door jerked open, and Frank Price appeared. A man in his early 40s, face flushed red from alcohol, eyes cloudy, wearing a once white t-shirt now yellowed and stained with marks of uncertain origin. He held a half-empty beer bottle, and the stench of liquor pouring off him was strong enough that Max had to suppress the urge to recoil. "What the hell?" Frank began to growl, then looked more closely at the man standing before him. The expensive 3-piece suit, the polished leather shoes, and the steel-gray eyes that anyone who'd lived in Chicago long enough would recognize. The blood drained from Frank's face at once. "Mr. Thornton?" he stammered, the beer bottle trembling in his hand. The haze of drunkenness seemed to evaporate in an instant, replaced by pure fear. Max didn't answer. He simply pushed the door wider and stepped past Frank into the apartment. What he saw made the cold anger in his chest flare sharper. The place was a chaos of neglect and squalor. Empty beer bottles littered the floor, the table, the torn sofa. The smell of alcohol, cigarette smoke, and spoiled food mingled into something that turned the stomach. The refrigerator in the corner of the kitchen stood open, holding only a few cans of beer and a carton of milk long past its date. No food, no vegetables, nothing a child could eat. Max moved slowly through the living room, his eyes recording every detail. Then he saw the corner near the window, a thin, worn blanket spread across the freezing concrete floor. No pillow, no mattress, no toys. Nothing to suggest that a 6-year-old child slept there each night except the familiar, faded dinosaur backpack lying nearby. Max turned to look at Tommy. The boy stood at the threshold, body drawn in on itself, eyes fixed on the floor. Then Max noticed Tommy glancing at something near the door. A brown leather belt hung from a nail in the wall, within easy reach of an adult hand. Tommy looked at it for a single second, then quickly looked away, shoulders tightening, head dropping lower. A small reflex. A brief moment, but enough to tell Max everything he needed to know. The anger in his chest shifted into something more dangerous, colder, deeper. Yet his face remained expressionless, his voice steady. "The boy's difficult, you know." Frank tried to justify himself, his voice trembling though he strained to sound normal. "I've done my best, but he never listens. His mother's dead. I've had to raise him alone. You understand? It isn't easy." Max turned, and the look in his eyes cut Frank off mid-sentence. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a threat. It was the look of a man staring at something lower than garbage, something not worth the expense of emotion. "This is what's going to happen," Max said, his tone even, as if delivering a business report. "I'm taking the boy. You'll receive money every month, more than any welfare check you're getting. In return, you disappear from his life, permanently." Frank blinked, his alcohol-dulled mind struggling to process. "You want to buy the kid? I want you to never show your face to him again." Frank licked his lips, greed flashing in his cloudy eyes. "How much?" Max named a number. Frank's eyes widened, and he nodded at once without a second's hesitation. "Deal. Take him. He's yours." Max didn't bother to shake his hand. He simply turned, gently placed his hand on Tommy's shoulder, and led the boy out of the apartment. As they passed Frank, Tommy shrank away, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and the drunken man. Frank didn't even look at the child. He just stood there, grinning, counting in his head the money he'd soon receive. They went down the stairs in silence. Outside, the snow was still falling, blanketing everything in white. Max was guiding Tommy toward the car when the boy suddenly stopped. "You're going to bring me back, right?" Tommy whispered, his voice heavy with suspicion and resignation. "Everyone always brings me back." Max halted. He crouched down, looked straight into those blue eyes marked by hurt, and spoke each word slowly and with certainty. "Never. You're never coming back here." Tommy searched his face for a sign of deception, for the hollow promise he'd heard too many times before, but he found nothing except absolute certainty in those eyes. The boy said nothing more. Pierce opened the car door, and Max gently helped Tommy inside. The black Maybach rolled away, leaving the south side behind, leaving the decaying apartment, leaving the leather belt hanging on the wall. Tommy sat quietly in the back seat, his backpack still resting against his chest. But this time he didn't clutch it as tightly as before. For the first time in many years, the backpack was no longer his only shield. The Maybach glided smoothly through the streets of downtown Chicago and came to a stop before a skyscraper of glass and steel. Tommy stared up through the car window, craning his neck back, trying to count how many floors the building had. But he gave up halfway because it was simply too tall. Pierce opened the door, and Max led the boy into the lobby. The doorman bowed, his eyes flickering over Tommy with curiosity he didn't dare voice. They stepped into a private elevator, reserved for the top-floor penthouse. Max swiped his card, pressed the button, and the elevator began its silent ascent. Tommy shrank into the corner, his backpack clutched tight against his chest, eyes following the numbers as they climbed on the display. 10, 20, 30, 40. He had never been this high in his life. The doors opened, and Tommy froze in place. Before him stretched a space so vast he couldn't take it in all at once. The ceiling soared above, floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealing the whole of Chicago spread out below, shimmering in the nightlights like a blanket of stars. The interior was minimalist in black, gray, and white. Everything so immaculate it felt almost sterile. Not a single unnecessary object, not a speck of dust, not a single sign that anyone truly lived there beyond a cold and deliberate perfection. Tommy gripped his backpack tighter, not daring to step farther. The penthouse was larger than the entire building where he had lived with Uncle Frank, and its luxury made him feel smaller than ever. He didn't belong here. He knew that. "Come in," Max said, trying to soften his voice more than usual. "This is home, for now." Tommy stepped cautiously across the elevator threshold, his dirty bare feet leaving faint marks on the white marble floor. He moved slowly, eyes darting around as if searching for hidden threats, mapping exits, judging which corner might offer shelter if needed. The behavior of a child accustomed to fear, Pierce stood off to one side of the living room, unsure what to do. He was used to shielding Max from enemies, used to handling situations that could turn deadly in an instant, but faced with a trembling 6-year-old, he was completely at a loss. Max realized he wasn't much better. He had built an empire, had made all of Chicago bow its head, had commanded hundreds under his authority. But he had never cared for anyone. He had never been responsible for anyone but himself. And now, standing in his $1 million penthouse. Maxwell Thornton didn't know what the next step was. "Are you hungry?" Max asked, the simplest question he could think of. Tommy gave a small nod but didn't move. He remained standing there in the vast living room, small and out of place. Max pulled out his phone and called his private chef. "Prepare something light. For a child." Silence lingered on the other end. The chef had worked for Max for 5 years, had prepared extravagant feasts of every kind, but had never once been asked to cook for a child. "Yes, sir," the chef finally replied, surprise evident in his voice. 20 minutes later, a tray was brought up. Small cut sandwiches, sliced fruit, a glass of warm milk. Max set the tray on the long glass dining table that could seat 12. "Sit and eat," he told Tommy. But Tommy didn't sit at the table. He looked around the room, eyes scanning every corner, then slowly walked to the farthest wall. He sat down on the floor, back against it, knees drawn to his chest. Familiar. Safe. This was how he had eaten for years in the corner of Uncle Frank's apartment, where he could see the whole room, where no one could approach him from behind. Max stood there for a moment, watching the boy curled in the corner of a $1 million penthouse. Then, without a word, he picked up the tray, walked over, and sat down on the floor beside Tommy. Pierce remained by the doorway, eyes wide. In 15 years at Max's side, he had seen many things. He had seen his boss negotiate with the most dangerous men in the city, had seen him issue orders with the cold authority of absolute power. But he had never seen Maxwell Thornton sitting on the floor eating sandwiches with a 6-year-old child. Tommy looked at Max in astonishment, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. Then he lowered his head, picked up a small sandwich, and began to eat. He ate quickly, almost swallowing without chewing, one hand holding the food while the other still clutched the backpack as if afraid someone might take it away. The behavior of a child who had known hunger, who never knew when the next meal would come. Max said nothing. He simply sat there, eating slowly, offering presents without pressure. He didn't know what he was doing, but instinct told him this was right. By the time Tommy finished eating, it was close to midnight. Max led him to the guest bedroom, a spacious room with a king-size bed dressed in white silk, soft feather pillows, and windows overlooking the entire city. Tommy stood in the doorway, staring at the bed as though it were something alien. He had never slept in a real bed, never had warm blankets, never had a pillow. "This is your room," Max said. "You'll sleep here." Tommy didn't answer. He only nodded slightly, then stepped inside as carefully as if he were afraid of breaking something. Max closed the door and walked to his own room at the end of the hall. That night, he lay awake, unable to sleep. The image of eyes marked by invisible wounds kept rising in his mind, tangled with the memory of another pair of eyes, just as blue, just as frightened, from long ago. The next morning, Max woke early. He walked to Tommy's room and knocked softly. No answer. He opened the door, and his chest tightened. The bed was still neat, the covers untouched. Tommy hadn't slept there. Max looked around the room and then saw him. Tommy was curled in the corner on the cold marble floor. He had pulled the blanket down and wrapped it around himself, clutching the old dinosaur backpack, sleeping in the corner the way he had slept for years. Max stood there, looking at the child asleep on the floor of his $1 million penthouse. He could buy anything in this world. He could make anyone bow. He could build and destroy empires, but he couldn't make a 6-year-old child feel safe enough to sleep in a bed. And for the first time in his life, Maxwell Thornton didn't know what to do with his power. On the second night, Max couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling in the dark. But his mind wasn't there. It was in the room at the end of the hall, where a 6-year-old boy was curled on a cold floor. At last, he gave up trying to sleep. He rose, slipped on his black silk robe, and walked toward his study. The room was spacious, lined with oak bookshelves, a walnut desk at its center, and a wall of monitors displaying security feeds from throughout the building. Max poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat in the leather chair behind the desk, and looked at the screens. Tommy's room appeared in black and white. The boy was still there, in the corner, curled beneath a blanket on the marble floor. The dinosaur backpack was clutched tight against his chest, his small shoulders trembling now and then from cold or from nightmares. Max lifted the whiskey to his lips but didn't drink. He simply watched the screen, watched the child sleeping in the corner, and the past began to rise like a tide that couldn't be held back. 21 years earlier, Max was 16. The Thornton family was already a force in the underworld of Chicago, and Raymond Thornton, his father, stood at the head of that empire. Max's mother had died young from illness, leaving him alone with a father who was cold and ambitious. 3 years later, Raymond remarried Claudia, a beautiful woman with calculating eyes and a smile that never reached them. Claudia brought with her a son from a previous marriage, a 5-year-old boy named Jamie. Raymond didn't care about the child, but he accepted him as part of the marriage arrangement. Claudia didn't care about her son either. To her, Jamie was a burden, an obstacle on her path to claiming the Thornton family's power and fortune. But Max cared. From the first moment he saw Jamie, with wide eyes and a shy smile, he felt something shift inside him. Perhaps because the boy reminded him of himself as a child, lonely and aching to be loved. Perhaps because he saw the way Claudia treated her son when no one was looking, cold, indifferent, sometimes cruel. Max became Jamie's only protector. When Claudia shouted, Max stepped between them. When Jamie cried alone in his room, Max was the one who came to comfort him. When the boy was afraid at night, Max lay beside him until he slept. They shared no blood, yet to Max, Jamie was a true brother. 3 years passed in that fragile balance. Then Raymond decided to send Max to New York to apprentice with a business associate. It was part of preparing an heir, and Max had no right to refuse. He still remembered the night before he left, Jamie clinging to his hand, eyes brimming with tears. "You'll come back, won't you?" the boy asked. "I'll come back," Max promised. "I'll always come back." But he was wrong. Max was gone 3 days. Only 3 days. When he returned to Chicago, Jamie was in the hospital. No one told him exactly what had happened. Claudia said the boy had fallen down the stairs. The servants said they hadn't seen anything. Raymond called it a tragic accident. But when Max looked into Jamie's eyes on that hospital bed, he didn't see the pain of an accident. He saw the fear of someone betrayed by the very person who was meant to protect him. And he saw the resignation of a child who had given up hope. Jamie didn't say anything to Max. He only looked at him with fading blue eyes, as if trying to memorize his face one last time. 2 days later, Jamie was gone, quietly, as if he had never existed. Max knew the truth. He knew what Claudia had done, but he had no proof, and Raymond chose to believe his wife. The empire mattered more than justice. Image mattered more than truth. And an 8-year-old child was buried in silence. 5 years later, Claudia died in a car accident. Brake failure. No one suspected anything. And Max never spoke of it to anyone. Now, in the darkened study, Max opened his desk drawer. His hand touched something small, cool, familiar. An old pocket watch, its silver casing dulled by time, the only thing he had left of Jamie. Max took it out and opened the lid. Inside, scratched in the uneven hand of an 8-year-old child, were the words, "For my big brother." Max remembered the day Jamie gave it to him. It was Max's 16th birthday, just before he left for New York. Jamie had spent all his small allowance to buy it from a second-hand shop, and had engraved the words himself with a nail. "So you'll always remember me," Jamie had said, his smile bright on his small face. "No matter where you go." Max closed his hand around the watch, his fingers tightening until his knuckles blanched white. He looked back at the security screen, where Tommy still lay curled in the corner, hugging his worn backpack like a lifeline, just as Jamie had once clutched a threadbare teddy bear each night. 21 years. For 21 years, Max had carried that pain, burying it beneath a shell of coldness and ruthlessness. For 21 years he had tried to forget, tried to move forward, tried to build an empire large enough to fill the hollow inside him. But the hollow had never been filled. And tonight, watching another child sleep in the corner with the same fear etched into his small body, Max realized he had been given a second chance. He raised the whiskey to his lips, drained it, and set the glass down with a soft thud. His eyes fixed on the screen where Tommy shifted in restless sleep. "This time," Max whispered into the darkness, his voice both promise and oath, "I won't lose." He had failed once. He had lost a brother. 21 years hadn't been enough to heal that wound, and perhaps never would be. But perhaps saving another child would be the first step. The third day brought a small but meaningful change. Tommy was still quiet, still slept in the corner instead of the bed, but he no longer curled there for the entire day. Instead, he began to move around the penthouse, always keeping a few steps behind Max, like a small and silent shadow. Max noticed, but said nothing. He went about his work, moving from room to room, always aware of the boy's presence somewhere behind him. Tommy didn't come close, didn't ask for attention, simply stayed within sight, as if afraid that if he let Max out of view, this man would disappear like every other good thing in his life. That morning, Max sat in his study handling paperwork that couldn't be delayed. He was reviewing financial reports on his computer screen when the familiar sensation came over him. He turned and saw Tommy standing in the doorway, half hidden behind the frame, eyes watching with curiosity mixed with hesitation. The boy didn't speak, didn't step inside, just stood there like a small ghost waiting for permission. Max gestured with his hand. "Come in." Tommy slipped inside, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. He circled the room, chose the farthest corner, and sat down with his backpack beside him. From there, he could see both Max and the door. Always an exit, always alert. Max turned back to his work, but he watched from the corner of his eye. Tommy was staring at the computer screen where numbers and charts shifted and moved. The eyes brightened with something other than fear, a pure childlike curiosity. "You like numbers?" Max asked, keeping his voice gentle in a way that still felt unfamiliar. Tommy nodded, then did something unexpected. He spoke more than he had in the past 3 days. "Mom taught me, with candy, before Mom left." His voice grew smaller at the end, as if the word left was too heavy to say aloud. Max let the words settle in the quiet. Then he opened his desk drawer, where he kept a box of chocolate candies for late nights. He took the box out, stood up from his chair, and did something Maxwell Thornton hadn't done in over 20 years. He sat down on the floor. In the middle of his $1 million study, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago lowered himself onto the hardwood floor and set the box of chocolates in front of them. Pierce would think he'd lost his mind. All of Chicago would think he'd lost his mind. Max didn't care. "Show me what your mom taught you," he said. Tommy looked at Max, looked at the candy, then back at Max. He hesitated, as if waiting for a trap, waiting for cruelty hidden behind kindness. But Max only sat there, patient. Finally, Tommy moved closer, still keeping an arm's length between them but near enough to touch the candy. He arranged the chocolates in a row and counted clearly in English. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he separated 2 pieces and pointed at the rest. 5 minus 2 equals 3, Tommy said, his voice small but steadier. He rearranged them, added more, took some away, explaining each step the way his mother had shown him. And as he did, something remarkable happened. Tommy smiled. It was tiny and fleeting, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It vanished almost at once, as if he suddenly remembered he wasn't allowed to be happy. But Max had seen it. That brief, fragile smile warmed something long frozen inside him. They stayed there for a while, Max listening as Tommy counted candy, nodding now and then, asking simple questions. For the first time in 3 days, the boy looked like an ordinary child instead of a frightened animal. A knock sounded at the door. Pierce stepped in, mouth already open to report something, then stopped short. His eyes widened at the sight before him. Maxwell Thornton, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, sitting on the floor with a 6-year-old boy, learning math with chocolate candy. Pierce stood there for a long moment, trying to process what he was seeing. Then he quietly withdrew and closed the door, deciding whatever he needed to report could wait. That afternoon, Max's private doctor came to the penthouse. He was an older man with salt and pepper hair who had served the Thornton family for more than 20 years and knew how to keep silent. He examined Tommy in the living room with patience and care while Max stood in the corner watching. Tommy allowed the examination, but his eyes never left Max for a single second, as if afraid that if he looked away, the man would vanish. Afterward, the doctor stepped into the hallway where Max waited. "The boy is underweight," he said gravely. "There are signs of prolonged neglect, mild malnutrition, some old injuries that have healed." He paused, meeting Max's gaze. "This child has endured a great deal, Mr. Thornton. He needs time, he needs patience, and he needs someone who won't give up on him." Max nodded. He didn't ask for more details. He didn't need them. He had seen the apartment, seen the belt on the wall, seen the way Tommy flinched at every loud sound. He understood enough. After the doctor left, Max's phone vibrated. His private attorney's voice came through tense and cautious. "Mr. Thornton, I'm hearing that you're keeping a child in the penthouse. I have to warn you, this is a significant legal risk. There's no paperwork, no guardianship, and with your reputation, if anyone finds out..." Max ended the call before the man could finish. He stood there for a moment, thinking, then called Pierce in. "Find me the best family lawyer in this city," Max said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Someone who isn't afraid of me, and someone who can't be bought." Pierce studied his boss for a long moment. He had followed Max for 15 years and had seen many unexpected things, but nothing like this. At last, he nodded. "Yes, sir." 2 days later, Pierce found the person Max had asked for. Josephine Hartwell, 34 years old, a former federal prosecutor who had moved into family law. She was known for 2 things: an almost flawless record in court and an uncompromising refusal to be bribed or intimidated. Max arranged the meeting at another penthouse he owned, one used for formal business appointments, not the one where Tommy was staying. Not yet. Josephine Hartwell arrived exactly on time, not a minute early, not a second late. Her auburn hair was pulled neatly at the nape of her neck, her gray suit tailored to precision, her brown eyes sharp as blades. She crossed the room with confident steps, her gaze sweeping once over the lavish space before settling on Max. Pierce stood in his usual corner, arms folded, wearing his familiar, threatening expression. Josie didn't spare him a glance. She walked straight to the chair opposite Max and sat down without waiting to be invited. Max observed the gesture with quiet interest. Very few people dared to sit before him without permission. Fewer still did so without a trace of fear. "Mr. Thornton," Josie said, her voice calm as if speaking to an ordinary client in an ordinary cafe. "I know who you are. Half of Chicago knows who you are. So let me be clear from the beginning. I don't care about your business. I care about one thing. Is that child safe with you?" Max wasn't accustomed to such directness. He tilted his head slightly, reassessing the woman before him. She didn't tremble. She didn't glance at Pierce. She didn't seem impressed or intimidated by the wealth and power surrounding her. She simply sat there, spine straight, eyes steady, waiting for his answer. "If I intended to harm him," Max replied evenly, "I wouldn't have called a lawyer. That's exactly what someone intending harm might say," Josie answered without hesitation. "I used to be a prosecutor, Mr. Thornton. I've seen every kind of monster. Forgive me if I don't take your word at face value." A reluctant flicker of respect stirred in Max. The woman had courage. In his world, courage was rare and valuable. "What do you need to believe me?" he asked. "The truth," Josie said. "And don't waste my time with lies. A mafia boss wants to adopt a child. How do you think a judge will respond?" "I'm a businessman, and I'm the Queen of England," Josie replied dryly. "Let's skip the performance. If you want my help, you'll answer honestly." Silence settled over the room. Pierce shifted slightly, his hand moving instinctively inside his jacket, but Max signaled him to stand down. "Fine," Max said at last. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start with how you found the child," Max told her. "Not every detail, but enough. The snowstorm, the boy outside the convenience store, Frank Price's apartment, the exchange of money." Josie listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she remained quiet for a long moment. "I want to meet the child," she said. "Alone." Max didn't like that. He didn't like anything beyond his control. But he understood this was a test, and if he wanted Josie's help, he would have to pass it. "All right," he agreed. They went to the penthouse where Tommy was staying. Josie met the boy in the living room while Max stood in the doorway observing. She spoke gently, asked simple questions without pressure. Tommy answered briefly, his eyes constantly flicking toward Max to make sure he was still there. And when Josie asked whether he wanted to stay with Mr. Thornton, Tommy nodded at once, then moved closer to Max, as if afraid the lawyer might take him away. Josie noticed everything. She saw how Tommy reacted, saw how he sought safety in Max, saw that the fear in his eyes wasn't fear of the man, but fear of losing him. "Interesting," Josie said later in the hallway, out of Tommy's hearing. "He's afraid, but not of you. He's afraid of losing you." Max didn't answer, but something shifted inside his chest. "I'll take the case," Josie said, "on conditions. Name them. First, you agree to a full background investigation. Second, there will be a social worker assessment of your home and your capacity to parent. Third, you'll prove financial stability, which won't be difficult, and parental capability, which will be much harder. Fourth," she paused, meeting his gaze directly, You must be prepared to face your past in court if necessary. All of it. No concealment. Do you understand what that means? Josie asked. Your entire life will be scrutinized. Every decision, every action, every secret. Are you prepared for that? Max didn't hesitate. I understand. Josie studied him for a long moment, weighing what she saw. Then, for the first time since entering, she allowed herself the faintest smile, not warmth, but recognition, like a warrior acknowledging a worthy opponent. Good, then we have a chance. She rose, gathered her briefcase, and moved toward the door. Before stepping into the elevator, she turned back one last time. Mr. Thornton, Josie said, her voice no longer sharp but touched with something like curiosity. I've met many people who want to do the right thing. Very few are willing to pay the price for it. I'm curious which kind you are. She walked out, her heels echoing against the marble floor. Max remained standing, watching until the elevator doors closed behind her. He didn't answer her question aloud, but inside his coat pocket, his hand tightened around Jamie's old pocket watch, his fingers pressing into the cold silver casing. This time, he would pay whatever it cost. 3 days after the meeting with Josie, the social worker arrived as scheduled. Margaret Chen stepped out of the elevator at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, neither early nor late, carrying a worn brown leather briefcase and eyes that missed nothing. She was about 45, her salt and pepper hair neatly twisted at the nape of her neck, dressed in a simple gray wool coat. No jewelry, no makeup, nothing unnecessary. 20 years in child protective services had etched understanding into the lines of her face, and her eyes were sharp, but not cold, as if she had seen too much to be easily shaken, yet still cared enough to continue doing the work. Max greeted her at the elevator, Pierce standing just behind him as usual. Maggie shook Max's hand with a firm grip, her gaze sweeping over him as though reading a book. Then, she stepped past him and began walking through the penthouse without waiting to be invited. She moved slowly, observing every detail. The abstract painting worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on the wall, the black leather sofa without a single crease, the marble floors polished to a mirror shine, the bar stocked with expensive whiskey, arranged in precise rows, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking all of Chicago. It's beautiful, Maggie said, her tone neither impressed nor critical, simply factual, very clean, very empty. She stopped in the living room and turned in a slow circle. Where are the toys? She asked. Where are the books? The crayons? Max remained silent. He had never thought about those things. You have $1 million penthouse, Maggie continued, still without judgment. But nothing here suggests a child lives in it. Max didn't defend himself. She was right, and he knew it. He had spent his life building an empire, never a home. Maggie studied him for a moment longer. Where's the child? Max led her to Tommy's room. The boy was sitting in his familiar corner, the dinosaur backpack clutched to his chest, looking up when the door opened. At the sight of a stranger, Tommy shrank inward, eyes immediately searching for Max. This is Miss Chen, Max said gently. She wants to talk with you for a bit. Tommy didn't answer, only looked at Max anxiously. Maggie stepped into the room and sat down on the floor a few feet away, as naturally as if she had done this 1,000 times. She turned to Max. I need to speak with him alone. Max didn't like it. Every instinct in him wanted to stay, to control the situation, to shield Tommy from anyone who might take him away. But he understood this was a test, and if he failed it, everything would end before it truly began. I'll be right outside, he told Tommy, making his voice as steady as he could. Then he stepped into the hallway and closed the door, standing there with Pierce. Both men were tense, both silent, both staring at the closed door as if they could see through it. Inside, Maggie spoke softly to Tommy, her tone gentle, unpressured. Do you like it here, Tommy? He nodded faintly, eyes still fixed on the door where Max had disappeared. Does Mr. Thornton treat you well? Tommy looked down, silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He doesn't yell. He doesn't hit me. Maggie didn't respond at once. That simple answer, that heartbreakingly low standard, told her more than any formal assessment ever could. This child had lived in a world where not being hit, not being screamed at, was a luxury. Where did you live before this? She asked gently. Tommy didn't answer. He only hugged the backpack tighter, head bowed, shoulders drawn in. She didn't press further. She had seen enough. 15 minutes later, Maggie stepped out into the hallway. Max straightened immediately, eyes searching her face for any sign. Maggie's expression had changed. The cool evaluation from earlier was gone, replaced by something closer to understanding. Max braced himself for the worst. He had seen how she looked at the empty penthouse, heard her questions about toys and books. He was certain she would demand the boy be removed, would say a Mafia boss had no business raising a child. Instead, Maggie said, "I've done this work for 20 years, Mr. Thornton. I've learned to judge people by what they do, not by their reputation." She paused, her voice softening. "That child has been through hell. I can see it in the way he clings to that backpack, in the way he flinches at loud sounds. But I see something else too." "What?" Max asked, tension tightening his voice. "Hope," Maggie said. "He has hope, and that tells me more than any background check ever could." Max stood there, unsure how to respond. This wasn't what he expected. "He can remain here temporarily," Maggie continued, "but you need to make changes. Create a child-appropriate space. Establish a stable routine. Demonstrate that you can balance your work with caring for him. I'll return for regular evaluations, and if I see progress, I'll support your petition for guardianship." She extended her hand. Max took it. The handshake was firm, an agreement beyond paperwork. "Don't disappoint me, Mr. Thornton," Maggie said. "That child deserves a real chance." She stepped into the elevator and disappeared behind the metal doors. Max remained standing there for a long moment, staring at the space she had just occupied. Pierce waited silently beside him. That night, after Tommy had fallen asleep, Max called Pierce into the study. "Find me an interior designer," he said. "Turn one of the rooms into a child's bedroom. Blue walls. Dinosaur theme." Pierce was quiet for a long beat. "Dinosaurs, sir?" "Dinosaurs," Max confirmed, thinking of the worn backpack Tommy never let go. "And buy books, and toys, and whatever else children need." Pierce said nothing, but as he turned to leave, Max could have sworn he saw the faintest smile flicker across the usually stoic bodyguard's face. 2 weeks passed, and things began to settle in a way Max had never believed possible. The empty room at the end of the hall had been transformed into Tommy's room. The walls painted a soft blue with dinosaur decals scattered across them, a small bed with a thick quilt, shelves filled with brightly colored comic books, and a play corner crowded with dinosaur toys of every kind. Tommy had agreed to sleep in the bed, though he still clutched the old backpack each night, a habit too deeply rooted to abandon. He had started talking more, asking questions, even walking through the penthouse without trailing Max step by step. Life was finding a new rhythm, strange, but not unpleasant. Max woke earlier to have breakfast with Tommy before work. In the evenings, he read stories aloud, his voice still steady and measured as if reciting financial reports. Pierce learned to buy fresh milk and cereal instead of only black coffee and whiskey. Nothing was perfect, but it was progress. Until that afternoon, Max was in his study reviewing contracts that required his signature when Pierce entered with an expression rarely seen on his face. "We have a problem, sir," Pierce said, low and urgent. "Frank Price is downstairs in the lobby. He's drunk, and he's causing a scene." Max rose at once without a word and walked toward the elevator. As it descended, the familiar cold anger began to rise in his chest. The agreement had been clear. The money had been transferred. Frank Price was supposed to disappear from Tommy's life forever. When the elevator doors opened to the lobby, Max heard the shouting before he saw the man. "I want to see Thornton. He kidnapped my nephew. Somebody call the police." Frank stood in the center of the lobby, face flushed from alcohol, shirt wrinkled, arms flailing. 2 building guards were trying to restrain him, but he kept yelling, drawing the attention of passing residents. Max stepped out of the elevator, and the lobby seemed to freeze. People moved aside. The guards paused. Frank turned to face the man who had appeared. At the sight of Max, he stumbled back instinctively, but the alcohol fueled his courage and he pointed accusingly. "There he is. Child kidnapper!" Max didn't raise his voice. He walked forward with measured steps, eyes glacial. Frank retreated until his back hit the glass wall. "We had an agreement," Max said quietly, more dangerous than any shout. "The agreement's changed," Frank yelled, trying to sound brave though his hands trembled. "You think you can take my nephew and toss me pocket change? I want more. More. Or I go to the police. I go to the press. I tell the whole world the great Maxwell Thornton kidnaps children. You won't. Try me, Frank sneered, spittle flying. You think your reputation survives those headlines? Mafia boss kidnaps child. Even if they can't prove it, the damage is done. You lose everything. Me? I've got nothing to lose. Max's fist tightened inside his pocket, knuckles whitening. Every instinct screamed to handle this the old way. One call, one order. And Frank Price would never trouble anyone again. But he couldn't. If he touched Frank now, he would lose Tommy. Josie had made it clear. Everything had to be legal. Clean. One mistake, and it would all collapse. Remove him, Max told the guards, voice cold as steel, and make sure he doesn't return. The guards dragged Frank toward the exit as he struggled and shouted, "This isn't over, Thornton. I'll get the boy back. You'll see. You'll see." His voice echoed even after the doors shut behind him. Max stood there a long moment staring at the glass, containing the fury burning inside. Then he turned and rode the elevator back up. When the doors opened, Pierce was waiting, unusually tense. "Tommy?" Max asked immediately. Pierce swallowed. He saw the security feed. "I was showing him how the system works because he was curious. Then Price showed up on the screen. And Max didn't wait. He moved through the penthouse calling Tommy's name. No answer. He checked the boy's room. Empty. The living room. Empty. The study. Empty. His heart began to pound with a panic he hadn't felt in years. Then he noticed the closet door in his bedroom slightly ajar. He walked over and pulled it open. Tommy was curled in the darkest corner, knees to his chest, arms wrapped tight around the dinosaur backpack, trembling. When the light reached him, he looked up, eyes flooded with tears and terror. "He'll take me back," Tommy whispered, voice breaking. "He always finds me. I'll have to go back." Max knelt at the closet door, bringing himself to eye level. "Tommy, look at me." The boy lifted his face, tears streaking down thin cheeks. "No one," Max said, voice firm as iron though his eyes softened. "No one can take you from here. I swear." Tommy searched his face for deception, for the hollow promises he had heard too often. He found only certainty, determination, and something else he had never seen in an adult's eyes before. Genuine care. Tommy said nothing. He threw himself out of the closet and into Max's arms and cried. Not loud sobs, but the choked, silent crying of a child used to not being allowed to cry. And Max, who hadn't held anyone in 20 years, held him tight. He didn't speak. He simply held the boy as tears soaked into expensive fabric, and he made a vow deeper than the one he had spoken aloud. Frank Price would never lay a hand on Tommy again, one way or another. 3 days after the chaos in the lobby, the storm arrived exactly as Frank had threatened. Max was in his study early that morning when Pierce entered carrying a stack of newspapers, his expression grim. He laid them across the desk without speaking, and Max only had to glance at the front page to understand. Business billionaire accused of child kidnapping. The headline ran bold across the front of the Chicago Tribune, accompanied by an old photograph of Max at some charity gala. Other papers carried similar stories, with titles like Reclusive Tycoon and the Disappearance of a 6-year-old Boy and Grieving Uncle Fights to Bring Nephew Home. None of them dared call Max a mafia boss outright, but phrases like controversial business history and questionable associations said enough. Frank Price had moved faster than Max anticipated. He had hired a lawyer, a second-rate attorney who thrived on sensational cases, and filed suit accusing Max of child kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and bribery to obtain guardianship. Worse, Frank had gone on television. Pierce turned on the screen, and they watched the interview replayed across every local news channel. Frank sat beneath bright studio lights, wearing a clean white shirt, hair combed neatly, looking nothing like the drunken man from the lobby. He wept on camera, tears sliding down his cheeks, voice thick with sorrow. "I'm just an ordinary man. Tommy is all I have left of my sister. That billionaire came and took my nephew. I don't have fancy lawyers. I don't have money. I just want my nephew home. Tommy is my only family." Pierce folded his arms, frowning. "He's a good actor. I almost believe him." Max didn't respond. His eyes were ice as he watched the tearful performance. He knew the truth. He had seen the apartment, seen the leather belt, seen the way Tommy flinched at heavy footsteps. But cameras didn't capture those things. The public couldn't see them. They saw only a poor, grieving uncle begging for his nephew's return. The consequences came swiftly. The police called, requesting that Max come to the station to clarify certain matters related to the case. He had attorneys, so they couldn't do much. But the public nuisance was real. Child Protective Services also called, asking to interview Tommy to confirm his well-being and ensure he wasn't being coerced. Maggie Chen intervened and eased the immediate pressure, but scrutiny mounted by the day. Worse still, some of Max's business partners began to withdraw. No one said it outright, but meetings were canceled, contracts delayed, calls unanswered. In business, reputation was everything, and no one wanted to be linked to a child kidnapping scandal. That afternoon, Josie Hartwell arrived at the penthouse for an emergency meeting. She sat across from Max in the study, her expression more serious than ever. "Frank doesn't have strong legal ground," she said. "He signed relinquishment documents when he accepted your payment. We have proof. But he has something more dangerous at the moment." "Public opinion," Max replied. "Exactly. And with your history, the court will lean toward the narrative of the struggling uncle. Judges are human. They read headlines. They watch the news. Even if evidence favors us, first impressions are hard to undo." "What do we do?" Josie was silent for a long moment, brown eyes steady on his. "We need Tommy to testify. We need him to tell the truth about how Frank treated him." Max went still. "He's 6. "I know," Josie said quietly. "I know it's difficult, but without Tommy's statement, it's your word against Frank's. And right now, Frank has the public's sympathy. The boy is the only one who can change that." Max said nothing. He thought of Tommy's eyes when Frank appeared on the security screen, of the trembling in the closet, of the silent tears. How could he ask the boy to face that fear again? How could he ask him to relive it before a room of strangers? But without it, he would lose him. Josie left after an hour, leaving Max alone with a decision that couldn't be avoided. That night after dinner, Max sat beside Tommy on the living room sofa. The boy held a new stuffed dinosaur Pierce had bought the week before, though the old backpack still rested close at hand. "Tommy," Max said gently, "there's something we need to talk about." Tommy looked up, anxious. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, not you." Max drew a slow breath. "Some people are saying things. About me. About you. We may have to go somewhere where people will ask you questions. And you might have to talk about before." Tommy was quiet for a long time. He looked down at the toy in his hands, fingers brushing the small plastic ridges along its back. The room felt heavy, the clock ticking softly on the wall. Then Tommy looked up, blue eyes meeting Max's. "If I tell, you'll stay with me?" Max felt something tighten deep in his chest. He took the boy's small hand in his own. "Always," he said, and it was the most honest promise Maxwell Thornton had ever made. Tommy nodded, slow and fragile. He didn't say anything else. He leaned against Max, resting his head against his arm as if seeking warmth and certainty. And in that moment, Max understood that the boy believed him with whatever pieces of trust remained inside a heart that had been hurt too many times. He wasn't allowed to fail. The scandal didn't just tear through Max's personal life. It spread into the world he had spent 20 years building. In the dark alleys of Chicago, in the VIP rooms of nightclubs, in hushed calls made from burner phones, rumors moved like wildfire. Maxwell Thornton, the coldest boss in the city, was raising a child. Maxwell Thornton was being sued for kidnapping. Maxwell Thornton was growing weak. The call from Giovanni Russo came one morning while Max was reviewing reports in his study. The phone vibrated, and the name on the screen was one he had no desire to see. He hesitated for a second, then answered, "Maxwell, my friend." Giovanni's voice flowed through the line, warm and lined with false concern. "I hear you're having troubles. Tragic." Max knew Giovanni Russo wasn't a friend. They had been rivals for years, dividing Chicago in a fragile balance. Giovanni controlled the east side, Max the rest, and both men waited for the right moment to swallow the other whole. This call wasn't sympathy. It was reconnaissance. "What do you want, Giovanni?" Max asked evenly. "Just checking in. Some people are saying you're distracted. Softening. I told them that can't be true. The great Maxwell Thornton distracted by a child? Impossible." Max heard the meaning beneath the sugar. Giovanni was probing for weakness, gauging whether this was the moment to strike. "Thank you for your concern," Max replied, voice cold as ice. I'm fine. Good, good. We'll see each other soon, yes? There are territorial matters to discuss. Giovanni ended the call, leaving behind a silence thick with threat. Max stared at the phone for a long moment before setting it down. That night, he summoned his inner circle. They met in a sealed room beneath a club he owned, a place without listening devices and without cameras. 7 men sat around the long oak table, faces lit by low amber light. Pierce stood behind Max as always, eyes moving over every man present. The air felt heavy with tension. Max could sense doubt in the room, in sideways glances, in the way some men avoided his gaze. The meeting began with routine reports, but he knew it was prelude. Then Vincent spoke. Vincent had been with him nearly 10 years, and that longevity gave him the illusion of permission. With all due respect, boss, Vincent began, voice careful but edged with dissatisfaction. This situation with the kid makes us look weak. People are talking. Other crews are talking. Maybe it's time to reconsider priorities. The room fell silent. Every eye shifted to Max. No one breathed. Max didn't shout. He didn't slam the table. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply looked at Vincent, and his gaze grew colder and colder until nothing remained but lethal stillness. The stillness before a storm. The stillness before someone dies. Vincent, Max said calmly, as if discussing the weather. The last man who questioned my priorities now runs a fish stall in Alaska. Do you like fish? Vincent swallowed, face draining of color. No, boss. I'm sorry, boss. Good. Max's gray eyes moved across the table, cutting into each man in turn. Does anyone else have questions about my priorities? The silence was absolute. Max nodded, rose, and left without another word. Pierce followed, closing the door and leaving the others in fearful quiet. Half an hour later, Giovanni Russo arrived for a previously scheduled meeting, part of the ritual diplomacy between their empires. Giovanni entered Max's rooftop office with a perpetual half-smile on his heavy face. He wore an expensive gray suit, gold rings glinting, looking as comfortable as if he were attending a party. Impressive as always, Giovanni said, referring to how Vincent had been handled. News traveled fast in their world. But I have a proposal. Go on. I can make your Frank Price problem disappear. Permanently. No lawsuit. No television interviews. No headaches. In return, just a small favor. A few blocks of territory up north. Max understood immediately. It was a trap. If he accepted Giovanni's help, he would owe a debt that could never truly be repaid. Giovanni would use it to tighten control, to slowly consume the empire Max had built. A serpent never offered gifts without poison. Generous, Max said without expression. But I handle my own problems. Giovanni shrugged, smile unchanged. As you wish. Just remember, a man with a weakness is a vulnerable man. And in our line of work, vulnerability gets people killed. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked out, leaving the warning hanging in the air like smoke. Max remained alone in the vast office, staring through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Chicago stretched beneath him, lights glittering like a field of stars, the empire he had forged with blood and authority over 20 years. Pierce entered after a moment, voice quieter than usual. Everything all right, boss? Max didn't turn. His eyes stayed on the city that bore his mark. I've fought my whole life to build this empire, he said, voice low and reflective. But this time, I'm fighting for something that actually matters. 1 week before the hearing, everything was ready. Josie had completed the entire case file, medical evidence, Maggie Chen's statement, the transfer receipts proving Frank had signed away guardianship. It was all organized in thick binders waiting for court. But today, Max chose not to think about work, about the lawsuit, about Frank Price or Giovanni Russo. Today belonged to Tommy. Pierce received clear instructions early that morning. No calls, no emails, no problems were to reach Max for 24 hours. Pierce looked openly surprised but nodded and withdrew. In 15 years, this was the first time Max had demanded an entire day without interruption. The morning began with breakfast on the sofa, something Max had never done before. They ate pancakes with maple syrup, Tommy sitting cross-legged on the cushion, the dinosaur backpack beside him like a trusted companion. After breakfast, Tommy asked if they could watch a movie, and Max agreed without hesitation. They sat on the black leather sofa, while the large screen played an animated film about dinosaurs that Tommy chose. Max didn't understand why dinosaurs spoke English or why they sang and danced, but he didn't question it. He listened as Tommy eagerly explained each species. That's a T-Rex. He's the king of everything. And that's a Triceratops. He has 3 horns to protect himself. And that tiny one is a Velociraptor. He runs really fast. Tommy spoke more than he ever had since arriving. His voice carried the bright enthusiasm of a normal child, free of constant fear. Max nodded, occasionally asking questions so Tommy could continue, and the boy answered with the confidence of an expert in a prehistoric world. At noon, they ate pizza. Max wasn't used to fast food, the heavy cheese and sweet tomato sauce far from his taste, but Tommy liked it, and that was enough. They sat on the living room floor, the pizza box between them, eating with their hands like 2 homeless men in a $1 million penthouse. Max found himself thinking that if anyone from his world saw this, his reputation would dissolve into nothing. In the afternoon, they built a Lego dinosaur castle. Pierce had bought a massive set with thousands of pieces, and Max quickly realized it was one of the most difficult challenges he had ever faced. The pieces were too small, the instructions too complicated, and hands accustomed to holding guns and signing contracts were ill-suited to snapping plastic bricks together. He muttered in frustration after assembling it wrong for the 3rd time, and Tommy giggled beside him, the clear sound of laughter filling the room. Pierce stopped by once to check in, and stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago struggle with tiny pieces of plastic, while a 6-year-old patiently instructed him. He had to turn away to hide the smile threatening to appear. When night came, after a simple dinner, Max led Tommy to bed. The blue room with dinosaur decals had become familiar, and Tommy climbed into bed without hesitation. Max sat beside him with a dinosaur comic Pierce had bought and began to read. He read terribly. His voice was flat, without rise or fall, delivering baby dinosaur dialogue the same way he would read a financial report. But Tommy listened with bright blue eyes, following each page as if it were the greatest story ever told. When the story ended, Tommy didn't fall asleep right away. He lay still for a while, then looked up at Max with unusual seriousness. "Why do you help me?" Max set the book aside and was silent for a long moment. He considered what to tell a 6-year-old, how to explain what even he didn't fully understand. "Because," he began slowly, "I once had a little brother, a long time ago. I didn't protect him. I wasn't there when he needed me." He paused, drawing a steady breath. "And I don't want to make that mistake again." Tommy thought about that with a gravity beyond his years. "Your brother. Where is he now?" "Somewhere very far away," Max answered softly. "But I think he'd be happy to see you." Tommy nodded as if that made perfect sense. He was quiet again, fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. When he spoke, his voice was very small. Can I call you Dad?" Max couldn't answer at first. His throat tightened, words caught behind something he couldn't swallow. He looked at the child before him, eyes filled with hope and fear, and felt something break open inside his chest. He only nodded, unsure he trusted his voice. Then he leaned down and pulled Tommy into his arms, holding him tight and long, as if afraid the moment would vanish like a dream. Tommy pressed his face into Max's chest, whispering warmly through the fabric. "Good night, Dad. Good night, son." The words came naturally, as if they had always been waiting. Max held him until the boy fell asleep, breathing slow and peaceful. Then he gently lowered him to the pillow, pulled the blanket up, and stood. He walked into the living room and stood before the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Chicago at night. In his hand was the old pocket watch, the only thing left of Jamie. He opened it and looked at the crooked engraving beneath the city lights. "For my big brother." Max lifted his eyes toward the dim stars above the glow of the city. "Do you see him, Jamie?" He whispered into the dark. "He's safe now. I promise. This time I won't fail." And for the first time in more than 20 years, Maxwell Thornton let the tears fall. The day of the hearing arrived beneath a gray sky and a wind sharp enough to cut through bone. The Chicago family courthouse stood in an old granite building, and today it looked like a fortress under siege. Outside, reporters pressed together, cameras aimed in every direction, microphones raised toward the line of black cars stretching along the curb. Max's Maybach pulled to a stop at the main entrance. Pierce opened the door, and Max stepped out in a flawless black 3-piece suit, his face carved from stone, revealing nothing despite the dozens of lenses trained on him. Josie walked beside him, briefcase heavy with documents, her stride confident and steady. Pierce and the security team formed a barrier, pushing back the most aggressive reporters while guiding Max and Josie inside. Shouts echoed behind them. Questions hurled about kidnapping, about Tommy, about Max's alleged ties to the underworld. Max didn't turn. He didn't answer. He walked forward with the calm of a man who had faced greater dangers. The courtroom was large, with high ceilings, oak benches, and natural light pouring through tall windows. Frank Price was already seated on the opposite side, wearing a cheap, wrinkled white shirt, carefully presenting the image of a poor uncle fighting to reclaim his nephew. When he saw Max enter, Frank attempted a smug smile, tinged with contempt, as if certain of victory. Max didn't look at him. He took his seat beside Josie and waited. Judge William Hayes entered minutes later, a man in his early 60s with silver hair, a stern face, and eyes sharpened by 3 decades of witnessing family tragedy. He was known for fairness, but also for conservatism, always placing a child's welfare above all else. Convincing him wouldn't be easy. The hearing began with formalities, then quickly shifted to argument. Frank's attorney, a slick, middle-aged man with oiled hair and a rehearsed smile, launched into a fierce attack. He described Max as a business magnate with a questionable past, emphasizing that a man who had never had a family and never raised a child had used money to buy a boy from his lawful guardian. He repeated the word kidnapping over and over, each time as if hammering a nail into a coffin. Josie responded with razor precision. She presented evidence of Frank's alcoholism, his unstable employment, the repeated police calls from neighbors reporting disturbances. She produced the payment receipts and the signed relinquishment documents, proving this was no kidnapping, but an agreement Frank had willingly accepted before greed overtook him. The tension escalated as arguments crossed the room like bullets. Then the turning point came. A side door opened, and Tommy entered. He looked heartbreakingly small in new clothes. A pale blue shirt and black trousers, clutching the stuffed dinosaur Pierce had bought the week before. He moved slowly, eyes scanning the room filled with strangers. Then he saw Frank. Tommy froze, face draining of color, body rigid. Panic flickered in his eyes as he searched the room for something, for someone. When his gaze found Max, he began walking again, each step carrying him toward the man seated across the aisle. Max wanted to stand, to cross the room, to shield the boy from every stare fixed upon him. Josie placed a steady hand on his arm. "Not yet," she whispered. Tommy was led to a small chair positioned before the judge, designed for child witnesses. Judge Hayes softened visibly, his voice gentler as he addressed the trembling boy. Josie knelt to Tommy's level. "Tommy, can you tell the court what it was like living with Uncle Frank?" Tommy said nothing at first, eyes lowered to his new shoes. "It's all right. Take your time." Silence stretched across the courtroom. "Did he ever hurt you?" Tommy didn't speak, but he nodded, very slight, very slow. That small nod said more than 1,000 words. Frank shot to his feet, face flushed. "He's lying! I never—" "Mr. Price, sit down immediately or I will hold you in contempt," Judge Hayes thundered. Frank collapsed back into his chair, silent at last. Josie turned to the bench, holding up a thick file. "Your Honor, these medical records speak for themselves. No 6-year-old should have a file this extensive." Judge Hayes accepted the documents and turned the pages slowly. His expression darkened, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. He said nothing, but his face revealed enough. Josie faced Tommy again, voice soft. "One last question, Tommy. Where do you want to live?" Tommy lifted his head, eyes scanning the room once more. When they met Max's, something shifted in the boy's gaze. Fear receded, replaced by certainty. "I want to live with Dad," Tommy said, his small voice clear in the stillness. "Dad Thornton." The courtroom froze. Frank's attorney stared open-mouthed. Frank went pale as if struck. Judge Hayes looked at Tommy, then at Max, then back again, something unreadable in his aging eyes. "The court will recess for 30 minutes before issuing a ruling," he announced. During that half hour, Tommy sat beside Max on the bench outside the courtroom. He didn't speak. He held Max's hand tightly, as if letting go meant losing him forever. Max said nothing either. He simply let the small hand cling to his own. They waited in silence, hope and fear braided together, while the clock ticked away each passing second. 30 minutes stretched like 30 years. Max sat on the hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, his back straight, his face unreadable, as still as a statue carved from stone. But inside, 1,000 scenarios raced through his mind at a brutal speed. If he lost, Tommy would go back to Frank. Or worse, the boy would be taken into the system, become one of the thousands of children passed from one temporary home to another. No one truly caring, no one truly loving. Max had seen children like that on the streets of Chicago. Children who grew up to become either prey or predator in the underworld. He couldn't let that happen to Tommy. If he won, he didn't dare finish the thought, didn't dare hope too much. Tommy sat beside him, his small hand still wrapped tightly around Max's, the stuffed dinosaur in his lap slightly crushed from being held too hard. The boy didn't speak, didn't ask questions, only sat and waited with a patience far beyond his years, as if he was used to waiting for adults to make decisions that would change his life, used to having no voice in his own fate. The courtroom doors opened. A court officer stepped out and called everyone back in. "Please rise." The clerk's voice rang out as Judge Hayes entered, his expression carefully neutral, revealing nothing of the decision to come. Everyone stood at once. Tommy stood close to Max, his shoulder brushing against the man's side, as if Max was the only shield between him and the world. Judge Hayes took his seat and glanced once more at the papers before him. The silence in the courtroom grew so heavy, it seemed possible to hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. "I have reviewed all the evidence presented today," he began, his voice low and steady. "I have heard testimony from both parties, and I have observed the child's reactions in this courtroom." He paused, his aging eyes turning toward Frank Price. "Mr. Price, your history of alcohol abuse, your chronic unemployment, and the medical records presented today paint a deeply troubling picture." Frank jerked upright, his face flushing red. "Your Honor, silence, Mr. Price. I am not finished." The judge's voice cut through the air like a blade, and Frank dropped back into his seat, his mouth open but no further words daring to escape. Hayes turned his gaze to Max, studying the man who stood motionless on the opposite side. "Mr. Thornton, your past does not fit the conventional mold. Many would question your suitability as a guardian." Max clenched his fist inside his pocket, his knuckles whitening. This was the moment everything could collapse. "However," Hayes continued, and the word hung in the air like a fragile thread of hope, "I have also witnessed something I do not often see in this courtroom. I have seen a child, despite all that he has endured, who has found someone he trusts, someone he calls father." He paused again, looking down at the documents before lifting his eyes with finality. "The ruling of this court is as follows. Frank Price is permanently stripped of guardianship rights over the minor Tommy Price. Frank Price is prohibited from coming within 500 meters of Tommy Price. The minor Tommy Price is placed under the temporary guardianship of Maxwell Thornton. Formal adoption will be considered after a 6-month probationary period, during which regular evaluations by Child Protective Services will take place." Frank Price shot to his feet like a wounded animal, slamming his hand against the table with a resounding crack. "This is bullshit! You can't do this! That boy is mine!" 2 court officers rushed forward, grabbing Frank by the arms and dragging him toward the exit. He struggled, shouting, his face purple with rage and the remnants of alcohol still burning in his blood. As they pulled him through the doors, he twisted back and screamed one last time at Max. "This isn't over, Thornton. I'll get the boy back. You'll see. You'll see." His voice echoed and then faded as the doors closed behind him. Max didn't respond, didn't turn, didn't even look. He only looked down at Tommy. The boy stood there, his eyes wide, not fully understanding what had just happened. He looked up at Max, his lips trembling as if he wanted to ask something but didn't dare. "Tommy," Max said, and his voice trembled slightly, a rare fracture that even Pierce, standing behind him, noticed with quiet astonishment. "You're staying with Dad? Really?" Tommy whispered, as if afraid to believe it. "I don't have to go back?" "Never. You will never have to go back there again." Tommy stood still for 1 second, then 2, then 3, as if processing the words, as if trying to understand that this was real and not a dream that would vanish when he woke. Then he threw himself into Max's arms, holding on tight, crying without sound, his tears soaking into the expensive fabric of Max's suit. Max held him, not caring that the entire courtroom was watching, not caring what the reporters outside would write, not caring about anything except the small, trembling child in his arms. Josie stepped close, her voice gentle but firm. "Congratulations. But remember, 6 months probation. Frank can still appeal. You have to keep everything perfect. Max nodded, his eyes never leaving Tommy. I will. They exited through a back entrance to avoid the press. Pierce had the car waiting, and Max carried Tommy into the back seat without a word. The boy was exhausted from the storm of emotion, his eyes swollen from crying, but a small smile rested on his lips for the first time all day. The Maybach rolled away from the courthouse, away from Frank Price, away from everything dark in Tommy's past. On the drive home, the boy fell asleep, his head resting against Max's shoulder, his breathing steady and peaceful. The stuffed dinosaur lay in his lap, and for the first time, he slept without clutching the old backpack. Pierce glanced at them in the rearview mirror, watching his boss sit perfectly still so as not to wake the child. He said nothing, but a faint smile touched his lips, a smile few people had ever seen. And Max, looking down at the sleeping boy beside him, felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Something warm, something light, something like peace. For the first time in a very long time, he felt as if he was going home. 6 months passed like a dream Max didn't want to wake from. In the first month, Tommy began kindergarten at one of the most prestigious private schools in Chicago, a place with security so tight that Max personally inspected it 3 times before giving his approval. On the first day of school, Tommy stood at the gates, his small hand gripping Max's, unwilling to let go. He stared into the playground filled with unfamiliar children, his eyes swimming with that old, familiar fear. Dad will be right here when school ends, Max said, bending down, his voice gentle but firm. I promise. Tommy studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether this promise was one he could afford to believe. Then he let go. He walked slowly into the yard, glancing back every few steps to make sure Max was still there. At 3 o'clock, when the dismissal bell rang, Max stood in the exact same spot, just as he'd promised. Pierce lingered a few paces away, silent as a shadow. The gates opened, and Tommy came running out with the brightest expression Max had ever seen on his face. Dad, I made a friend. His name is Kevin. It was the first friend Tommy had ever had in his life. In the second month, Max hired a child psychologist to meet with Tommy twice a week. Dr. Harrison was a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and endless patience. In the beginning, Tommy said nothing. He only sat and drew in silence. But slowly, through colorful pictures, he began to open up. The nightmares in the middle of the night grew fewer. Laughter filled the penthouse more often. Tommy no longer flinched at sudden loud noises. He no longer shrank away when strangers came too close. The third month brought Tommy's birthday, the first real birthday celebration he had ever known. Max didn't know how to throw a child's party, but he tried. There wasn't a crowd, just Max, Pierce, Josie, and Maggie Chen, but they were people who truly cared about Tommy, and that mattered more than any grand affair. A dinosaur cake, shaped like a T-Rex, sat on the table, 7 candles flickering on top. When Max carried it in, Tommy stared at it, his eyes widening, and then suddenly tears began streaming down his cheeks. Max panicked and set the cake down at once. What's wrong? Did something happen? Tommy shook his head, tears still falling even as a small smile formed on his lips. Nothing. I've never had a birthday cake before. The room fell silent. Josie turned away to wipe her eyes. Maggie Chen drew in a steady breath. Pierce stood motionless as stone, but his gaze softened in a way few had ever witnessed, and Max simply knelt and wrapped Tommy in his arms, holding him tight, saying nothing at all. In the 4th month, Max began to change the way he worked. He delegated more responsibility to Pierce, reduced unnecessary meetings, shortened trips out of town. He wanted to be there when Tommy came home from school. He wanted to sit down for dinner together every night. He wanted to read to the boy before bed. Pierce took on the extra weight without a single complaint. When Max asked if he minded, Pierce only shrugged. This is the first time I've seen you do something that truly matters, boss. I'm never going to complain about that. In the 5th month, Tommy brought home a drawing from school. The title Family was written in clumsy crayon across the top. There were 3 figures in the picture. A very tall man in a black suit, which was Max, a bald man with a serious face, which was Pierce, and above them in the sky, a bright yellow star. Max looked at the picture and pointed to the star. What's this, son? That's Uncle Jamie, Tommy said casually, as if he were talking about the weather. You said he's very far away, so I drew him in the sky, so he can see us. Max couldn't speak. His throat tightened. His eyes burned. He bent down and held Tommy close, burying his face in the boy's soft hair to hide the tears threatening to fall. In the 6th month came Max's first parent-teacher conference. He stood outside the classroom more tense than he'd ever been facing Giovanni Russo. Pierce came along because Max admitted he didn't know how to talk to ordinary parents. Inside, a mother with a friendly smile asked, "So what do you do for a living, Mr. Thornton?" Max paused for a second before answering simply, "Business." Pierce stood behind him, pretending to cough to hide the laugh that nearly escaped. Throughout those 6 months, the once cold penthouse transformed. Tommy's drawings covered the refrigerator doors, color flooding a place that had once known only black, gray, and white. Max learned to cook simple meals. The results weren't always good, but Tommy ate every bite without complaint. And the old dinosaur backpack that had once been Tommy's only shield now rested quietly on a bookshelf like a memory, no longer clutched every night. On the final night of the 6th month, they lay on the penthouse rooftop, looking up at the Chicago sky. The city lights washed out most of the stars, but a few still shimmered stubbornly overhead. Tommy lay beside Max, his stuffed dinosaur tucked in his arms, eyes fixed on the sky. "Dad," he asked softly, hope threading through his voice, "tomorrow I'll officially be your son, right?" Max looked up, searching for the brightest star. "Yeah, tomorrow everything becomes official." Tommy smiled and closed his eyes, his breathing gradually evening out. But before sleep claimed him, he whispered, "Good, because I've been your son for a very long time already." 1 week before the final hearing, unexpected news arrived. Josie called early in the morning, her voice carrying a tone Max couldn't quite place, neither clearly good nor clearly bad. "Frank Price has withdrawn his appeal." Max paused with his hand wrapped around his coffee cup, his brow tightening. "What? Why?" "I don't know the details, but I've heard he left Chicago. Moved somewhere far away. Very suddenly." Silence lingered on the line. Max didn't ask further questions. He didn't need the details. Perhaps Giovanni Russo had advised Frank that Chicago was no longer a safe place for him, a gift that didn't need to be acknowledged, a favor Max would never mention. Or perhaps Frank had finally realized he had no chance, that continuing the fight would only waste what little he had left. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Frank Price was gone. "What does that mean for tomorrow?" Max asked. "It means there's no opposition," Josie replied, and for the first time there was a trace of relief in her voice. "The hearing will be mostly procedural, but we still need to appear." The next day, Max brought Tommy to the Chicago family court for the final time. The atmosphere was completely different from the last hearing. There were no reporters crowding the steps outside, no shouting from Frank Price, no suffocating tension stretched tight as wire about to snap. They entered the courtroom with a calm Max hadn't expected. The chair across the aisle sat empty, the place where Frank had once worn his triumphant smile, now reduced to quiet space. Tommy sat beside Max, holding his hand, but there was no fear left in those eyes. The boy even smiled as he looked around the room, as though this were simply an interesting visit. Judge Hayes entered and everyone rose in respect. He took his seat, reviewed the documents before him, and nodded to begin. Maggie Chen was called first. She stood before the court with the steady composure of someone who had done this work for 20 years, her voice warm yet professional. "Over the past 6 months, I have witnessed remarkable progress. Tommy is healthy, happy, and thriving. He has friends at school. The nightmares have stopped. He laughs, truly laughs, every day." She paused slightly for emphasis. "The living environment has transformed completely. What was once a cold penthouse is now filled with drawings, toys, and warmth. Mr. Thornton has exceeded every expectation I had. And please understand, I set very high expectations." Josie followed with the legal report. All conditions had been met. There had been no violations during the 6-month probation. Every evaluation had been positive. Frank Price had withdrawn his appeal and left the city. There were no remaining obstacles. Judge Hayes listened quietly, occasionally nodding or making a note. When Josie finished, he lifted his gaze and looked at Max and Tommy seated side by side. "I have been doing this work for 30 years, he said, his voice thoughtful and low. "I have seen countless cases, countless families, countless endings. But this case is different." He paused, choosing his words with care. I have never seen a man change so completely because of a child. A man who, by every measure, already had everything: power, wealth, influence, yet chose to risk it all for a 6-year-old boy he found in the snow. He looked directly at Max, his expression searching but not condemning. "Mr. Thornton, do you understand the responsibility you are undertaking?" Max stood, his back straight, his voice steady. "I do, Your Honor. Do you promise to love, protect, and care for this child as your own?" Max looked down at Tommy, who gazed back at him with complete trust in his eyes. Then he looked at the judge, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I already have." Judge Hayes studied them for a long moment, then nodded, a rare faint smile touching his stern features. "This is the ruling of the court. Maxwell Thornton is granted full legal adoption of the minor Tommy Price, who shall henceforth be known as Tommy Thornton." Tommy looked up at Max, his eyes wide. "Thornton? Like you, Dad?" Max smiled, a warm and rare smile that belonged only to Tommy. "Like me. You're officially a Thornton now." Tommy threw himself into Max's arms, holding tight, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. Tears fell, but they were tears of joy, the kind the boy had never known before Max entered his life. Max held his son, and then he remembered. He slipped his hand into the pocket of his suit jacket and drew out the old pocket watch, the only thing left of Jamie. "This belonged to your Uncle Jamie," Max said, his voice unsteady. "He loved you very much, and I know he'd want you to have it." He placed the chain with the watch around Tommy's neck. The boy touched it gently, reverently, as though he understood that its value reached far beyond anything material. "I'll take care of it, I promise." They walked out of the courthouse hand in hand. Outside, Pierce stood waiting beside the black Maybach, and a rare smile rested on his lips, the kind few people had ever seen. Josie and Maggie stood on the courthouse steps, offering quiet applause as father and son emerged. The Chicago sun poured down, warm and bright, as though the sky itself were celebrating, and Max, the most feared crime lord in Chicago, smiled like an ordinary father. 1 year later, winter returned to Chicago. Snow blanketed the city, covering everything in a pure white hush that felt like a promise of new beginnings. But this time, the snow wasn't cold to Max. It was a promise of warmth inside, of a child's laughter echoing through the house, of hot coffee in the early morning and bedtime stories at night. Max had sold the penthouse. He no longer needed it. No longer needed the flawless chill of marble and glass. No longer needed a sweeping view of Chicago like a king surveying his kingdom. Instead, he bought a house in the suburbs, with a wide yard where Tommy could run freely, with maple trees that changed color each season, with ordinary neighbors and ordinary children. Tommy's room was on the 2nd floor, 3 times the size of the concrete corner where he had once slept in Frank's apartment. The walls were painted a soft blue and adorned with murals of ancient giants. His collection of prehistoric toys had grown so vast that Pierce had to install additional shelves. There were plush creatures, plastic models, Lego sets, and vibrant posters depicting the Jurassic Age. Even a model skeleton Max had ordered from a museum. The living room was warm and welcoming, with an oak fireplace and sofas people could actually sink into. And the kitchen. A kitchen Max truly used now, though his cooking skills were still only respectable at best. That morning, Max woke at 6, as he did every day. He went downstairs, turned on the stove, and began preparing breakfast. Fried eggs, which he finally no longer burned after nearly a year of practice. Toast, fresh orange juice, and a glass of warm milk for Tommy. Small footsteps padded down the stairs, and then a whirlwind of energy burst into the kitchen. "Good morning, Dad." Tommy ran over and wrapped his arms around Max from behind, pressing his cheek against his back. It had become their ritual, a hug before sitting down at the table, and Max wouldn't have traded it for anything in the world. "Good morning, son. Sit down and eat." Tommy climbed into his chair and began eating with the enthusiasm of a healthy, happy 7-year-old. He talked about a dream he'd had, about flying dinosaurs, about grand imagined adventures. Max listened, nodding, asking just the right questions to keep him going. The refrigerator was covered with dozens of Tommy's drawings layered on top of one another. They all shared the same theme: Dad and me. Max tall in a black suit, Tommy small beside him, and above them always a star. Uncle Jamie. On a shelf near the door, the old dinosaur backpack still rested, It was no longer clutched every night, no longer a shield against the world. Now it was simply a memory, a reminder of where Tommy had begun and where he stood now. And around Tommy's neck, Jamie's pocket watch caught the morning sunlight. A car horn sounded outside. Pierce had arrived. "Uncle Pierce is here." Tommy jumped down from his chair and grabbed his school bag. "Be good at school," Max said, ruffling his son's messy brown hair. "I'm always good." Tommy grinned and ran for the door. Before stepping out, he turned back for one more hug. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too." Tommy ran to the car where Pierce waited. Uncle Pierce, as Tommy called him, the man who had once been a cold bodyguard now learning how to smile at a 7-year-old child. Max stood at the door watching until the car disappeared around the corner. In that quiet moment, memory rushed back. The blizzard a year ago. A thin boy facing a brick wall, shivering, clutching an empty backpack. "I can't go home until I bring food back." Now that boy was laughing, running, living like an ordinary child. Loved. That afternoon, Tommy returned from school with a dozen stories. About Kevin, his best friend. About a new art teacher. About a math test where he'd earned a perfect score. Max listened to every word, nodding at the right moments, asking the right questions. They did homework together, then built Lego sets. Max was still terrible at Lego, the tiny pieces still testing his patience. But Tommy's giggles whenever he made a mistake erased every frustration. That evening, snow began to fall. White flakes drifted outside the window, dressing the garden in a fresh coat. Tommy jumped up, eyes shining. "Dad, snow! Can we build a snowman?" Max looked outside. Snow white and quiet, just like that night long ago. But this time, it carried no pain. It carried joy. Of course, they went into the yard, Tommy rolling snowballs while Max watched. Pierce was there too, at some point without Max even noticing, helping shape the snowman's body. The man who had once been nothing but a silent guardian now laughed openly as Tommy pressed a carrot into place for the nose. Max stood by the door, holding the old pocket watch Tommy had forgotten inside that day. He opened it and looked at the faded engraving. "For my big brother, I did it. Jamie," Max whispered into the winter air, his voice trembling. "This time I didn't fail." "Dad!" Tommy called out, running toward him, cheeks red from the cold, eyes bright as stars. "Come build the snowman with us." Max looked at his son, the child he had found in the snow a year ago, the child who had changed his life in ways he had never imagined possible. He smiled, a smile drawn from somewhere deep and true. "I'm coming." He stepped out into the white snow, where his family was waiting. In darkness, he had found light. In loneliness, he had found family. And in an abandoned child, Maxwell Thornton had finally found himself. Some men build empires with power and fear. He built his with love. The story of Maxwell and Tommy isn't merely the story of a crime lord and an orphaned boy. It's a story of redemption, of how it's never too late to change, of the healing power of love over even the deepest wounds. No matter who you are, no matter your past, there's always a chance to do what's right, to become better, to bring light to someone lost in darkness. If this story has touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss more moving stories each day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever met someone like Maxwell, seemingly cold yet carrying a warm heart? Or someone like Tommy, a child who only needed a single chance to be loved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly love to hear what's in your heart. We wish everyone watching this a life filled with health, joy, and peace each day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next story.